So Kevin's kind of just give you a lot of illustrations there about kind of how metadata can be your special best friend. But we wanted to quickly talk about a project which involves a number of different products called Life in a Day, which was an interesting project done last year, which is a nice little case study about kind of metadata and handling huge amounts of media as well. So Life in a Day was a project commissioned by YouTube and Google last summer. So on July the 24th last year, thousands of people around the world basically shot video diaries on a Saturday. And they compiled all of this kind of user-generated footage, shot on all sorts of different crazy kind of formats and cameras, and built it into a feature film documentary, which was shown at Sundance back in January. And it was also done a live kind of web stream at Sundance, as well as showing it in an actual cinema, kind of in Colorado. It's also actually being shown this year. It's coming out on July the 24th, actually at a movie theatre near you. So it's quite an interesting kind of documentary, but it involved a huge amount of kind of metadata and media within a short space of time to actually complete the project. So there was a huge amount of material. There was over 80,000 submissions, kind of clips essentially submitted, these video diaries people have shot. And there was, it says here 4,500 hours of material. It was nearly 5,000 hours of material. So combined, there was about 60 different formats and frame rates used. So it was a huge amount of media to sort of handle and kind of turn into a feature film within 6 months. A huge mess, in fact. So the challenge was like, how do you cut this down to a sort of 90-minute feature film within 5 months, basically? They had to kind of lock the edit down by December last year and actually kind of finish the online and finish the audio mixes and add the music and get it all prepared for Sundance. So they literally had 5 months to do the whole project in. So, like I mentioned earlier, there was a huge amount of different formats used. So it went from everything sort of phone cameras, shooting very kind of low frame rates at sort of 8 or 10 frames a second, all the way up to people shooting, more professional people who decided it'd be a fun thing to do. He was shooting on kind of P2 and XT-Cam and XT-Cam EX. But a lot of consumer cameras were used, so lots of like H.264 kind of based codecs, lots of DV files, lots of QuickTimes. I mean, it was like you had to sort of think of a camera. Somebody shot at some weird frame rate for this program. But people shot all sorts of footage. I mean, some of it was beautifully shot. Some of it was just a camera shaking away in someone's hand. I mean, it was just dreadful, but it was just a huge amount of kind of different formats to deal with. So it was a huge challenge for the production. How do they kind of get this into the editing environment and actually cut a feature film out of it and get it done in 5 months? So they decided, right, we're going to have one format for editing and we're going to have one frame rate for editing. We're going to get all these different formats. And we're going to need an awful lot of metadata handling because we've got media coming in from every country around the world. They also actually handed out some cameras in some third world countries for people to shoot video diaries and then send the kind of material back. So they had footage from just all around the world being shot in all sorts of bizarre places, from kind of war zones to kind of people on holiday to people kind of having their Saturday afternoon kind of football time. So they had to process like literally these 4,500, 5,000 hours of media. So this is the kind of post-production route path they came up with, which involved CatDV for logging, the Route 6 ContentAgent product for transcoding all these files, Media Composer for the offline and for conforming, Smoke for just finishing, and then it was all done on a Unity shared storage system, and then Lustre for the grade. So they basically used, for the logging, 25 CatDV systems. There was literally 25 people, logging people, researchers sitting in a room, basically going through this 5,000 hours worth of footage, trying to figure out what might work in the film and what might is just completely unacceptable. The camera work was just so shaky, or the sound was kind of cutting in and out. So they had 25 people literally sitting there kind of logging the crap out of this stuff, using CatDV, and they ended up with 80 different metadata fields. The reason it was 80 metadata fields was different loggers used sort of different metadata schemas they kind of built by themselves. If they'd all stuck to the same metadata schema, they would have had about 20, 25 metadata fields. But in the end, it ended up being 80, so an awful lot of information was going into each clip. So once they'd kind of finished logging the files, they then exported all this metadata for each clip, these 80 fields, as an XML file. And then that basically went into ContentAgent, and ContentAgent took all these 5,000 hours worth of material and then turned it all into DNX files. So ContentAgent's a transcoding platform Route 6 built, and it supports many different formats and frame rates and wrappers. So it's very good at handling many, many different source files and transcode them into other formats. And it has some very nice sort of automated tools in it to help with metadata tracking. So on the production, they had 2 of these systems just going 24 hours a day, churning out files, which were being immediately put onto the Unity system. So within ContentAgent, what would happen was that they would import like a few hundred clips at a time. Each day they'd finish kind of logging, and they'd pull in a few hundred XML files, which were the equivalent video file with the same naming convention. And then ContentAgent would automatically insert all these metadata fields into each clip. So, I mean, here's an example of one. So they didn't actually kind of fill out every metadata field because they were using their kind of own logging kind of methods, but this was definitely something for a French part of the production. So what ContentAgent would do is one thing is, inside ContentAgent it has this very elegant kind of workflow designer tool where you can build up workflows, and then once they're set, you can then basically use watch folders to automate the workflow. So once these files were kind of basically, the metadata was inserted into each clip, ContentAgent would basically frame rate convert any clip which wasn't 24 frames a second, and then it would turn them into DNX HD Avid files, which were very good for basically offline editing. So they actually produced a number of offline DNX files at 36 megabits, and then the whole stack of full resolution files at 185 megabits a second. And then once all these files were kind of created, the metadata was inserted into them. So, and it was then written directly to the shared storage system, directly to the media files folder. So the Avid editors could literally refresh their bins, and these files would just keep appearing, or they'd use Media Tool within the Avids to search for the files. So after kind of Avid basically picked up the files, there was essentially 8 different Avid system users in the production. So there was 2 main editing systems. There was a main editor and then his main assistant. And then they had 6 assembly editors who were just building smaller kind of little stories up to show to the main editor. Because it was so much material, it was impossible for just one person to edit this in 5 months. It'd be pretty difficult to edit 5,000 hours of material down to 90 minutes. So they had like 6 people sitting there just assembling smaller kind of rough cuts. And then he would basically kind of finesse them, the main editor. But it was a huge, huge sort of process just having these ContentAgent systems churning away each day, making these files, and then putting them onto the Unity, ready for editing immediately. So once the kind of they'd finally kind of edited it down to sort of the 90 minutes, they then took it into Smoke. So one of the things I mentioned is they actually did the full conform within Media Composer, so they then relinked the high-res files. So in the end you had just DNX HD files as the master high-res files of the edit. And then they made essentially a QuickTime uncompressed file, which then they just put into Smoke, did a little bit of compositing, used a few other tools to do other bits of compositing, and then they outputted DPX files into a Lustre and did a digital intermediary and kind of grade. And then they built files out of that for the web showing at Sundance. And then they also built files for actually showing that in the cinema, kind of a digital projection at Sundance. So, I mean, overall, they actually used Media Composer to do all the conforming, and they just really used Smoke to do the kind of tidying up of the project. So that was kind of the whole kind of post workflow in a kind of nutshell. Really, the thing to get over here is they wouldn't have been able to have done this project without the metadata schemas really they created, and metadata they used in CatDV, because within the Avid sort of ecosystem, they had to search on all these different metadata fields. It was the only way they could actually keep a track of 5,000 hours worth of material. So it was a very aggressive kind of post schedule in the end with probably, I've never seen a project with so many different formats. I mean, generally when you make a feature film, you choose a camera format or a film format and you shoot it on that one format and then edit in a sort of digital domain. But this was a very different, you kind of user-generated film, so very different kind of approach. But really, sort of the summing up of it is kind of, you must use something like a CatDV system for logging to be able to kind of take all this metadata, use something like ContentAgent to actually do all the encoding. Try not to do huge amounts of transcoding on your editing systems. Use those actually for editing rather than transcoding. And that kind of sums it up, really. Thank you.